The Curse in the Colophon, Chapter 3. The process of adjustment to French life, though frequently trying, is always full of interest. There is a certain piquancy about the currency and what it is worth. The language, too, invariably reveals some new idiosyncrasies, and there is always the inexhaustible mysteries of the French character to be explored. Deeply absorbed with these and other cares, my first days in Paris were fully occupied. I was not a little sustained by the prospect of reunion with Laetitia, who was soon to come over from England for a few weeks in France. The ambassador is sure to give a tea or something on the 4th, she had hopefully observed. He always does. Meantime, I made such inquiries as I could about the bibliotheca as to the problem of our colophon, but nobody seemed to have much to offer on that subject. It was certainly not at all the usual thing, they all agreed. Colophons they knew, and curses they knew, but a colophon that cursed the reader was something beyond their experience altogether. When, therefore, I wandered around the ambassador's hospitable rooms on the anniversary of our independence, keeping my rendezvous with Laetitia, I had nothing more to report upon the problem of the St. Gall manuscript. I found her at length surrounded by a small group from which she extricated herself as I appeared. She was already faintly tinted by the British out-of-doors and seemed to be in the pink. "Oh, here you are," she exclaimed. "Well, how has Paris been treating you?" I reported favorably on my treatment and conducted her to a secluded corner of the conservatory that I had previously spotted, where we found that there was a lot to say to each other about the fortnight that had elapsed since we left the Empress. "And by the way," said Tish, suddenly becoming serious and important, "I've been working on those miniatured manuscripts we talked about, and what do you think? It's a curious fact that most of the finest ones that have turned up in the past 50 years all hail from a central special section of Anatolia south of Sinope. They have come to light at intervals, but all that can be learned as to where they came from points to the same general area. The strangest part of it is that nobody knows of any particular monastery or convent there of any importance where they might have been preserved. There seems to be an unknown source there from which every few years another beautiful manuscript, a regular star piece, hardly matched in the world, suddenly shows up." "How did you come by this idea?" said I, struck, I must confess, by the thing. "Have you been talking with somebody at the British Museum?" "Of course I have," Tish replied, "but I didn't get the idea from them, at least not expressly. I thought of it myself, just by putting two and two together, as it were. I happened to notice the source reported for a lovely lot of miniatures in New York, and then I noticed the same general source was reported for another fine one in the British Museum, and then I heard of one in Chicago and one in Baltimore, said to come from that locality. I began to get a good deal excited by this time, and took the pains to look up the sources of the finest things of the kind that have turned up of late years, and practically all of them come from the same limited region, yet no one knows exactly where." "Sounds to me like a discovery, I must say," said I heartily, "though I don't know what we can do about it. It would take an expedition to get to the district and make a survey of it." "That's it exactly," Tish went on. "It really calls for a small but well-organized paleographical survey of a piece of Anatolia that is roughly 100 miles each way. That's what I'd like to see made. Of course, the cachet may be exhausted. Perhaps it also has already given up its last manuscript, but I don't think so." "It's very curious that they've been coming out so gradually," I remarked. "How long did you say this has been going on?" "Oh, for 50 years at any rate, and I've found out about at least a dozen that have come from there, or at least are said to have. You know how quiet the dealers all keep about where they get their manuscripts. Even Tischendorf used to say he found a manuscript in the dustbin of an ancient convent. It's very hard to find out where any good manuscript really came from. I thought of the miniatured Revelation manuscript back at the university, with the previous owner's name scratched out, and told Laetitia about it, and how Wyndham had read it just from an ordinary photograph. She thought it a very smart piece of work. And you have a curious satisfaction," she added, "when you find out something somebody has tried to conceal from you, when you need to know it so badly, and ought to know it too. Why should they want to cover things up so, anyway?" "Well, of course, sometimes, like Tischendorf, they want to go back to that place again and try to find some more good things. And some dealers may get things from places or people that haven't a clear title to them, you know." I know," said Tish, "though I'm not one of those people that think every manuscript that's for sale must have been stolen from somebody. I think there are lots of legitimate ways for them to come into the market, if we just understood the facts." "To know all is to forgive all," I muttered reminiscently. "Well, I suppose this heavy secrecy of the dealers is really no more than professional habit. Part of the ethics of their business. They do it because they've always done it, and their fathers before them. Why, there are antique dealers in Paris that have been in the business for 100 years. Same family, I mean. Father, sons, and grandsons. Very nice people, too, some of them, I believe, Tish answered charitably. But some funny things happened to them, too. A big one in London, not long ago, published a picture of a page of a manuscript which lacked its last leaf, and so didn't have any scribe's name or date at the end. The university out west bought it, and their smart young men got at it and found that it was in the hand of Pamphilus the Studite, one of the best Greek scribes of the Middle Ages. A dozen of those manuscripts are scattered over Europe and America. The dealer had published a picture of the page, but had never dreamed that scribe was anybody in particular. So we have our jokes on them too now and then. Look here, said I, it strikes me you're getting into this manuscript business pretty deep. I thought you only knew about miniatures, and here you are up on Colophon, scribes, and all the rest. For a modern girl, Tish pretty nearly blushed, and her answer was certainly a trifle hurried. Oh, well, you know, one thing leads to another, she said easily. But hadn't we better be looking for some tea or something to drink? I skipped luncheon on the strength of this party and began to feel as though I could do with a bit of food. So we left the conservatory and found our way to the dining room, where Tish hopes were amply rewarded. There we ran into some people we knew, however, and there was no opportunity for further confidences until we left the embassy and I was escorting her home. Where are you going to try out that St. Gall's thing? She inquired. When are you going to try out that St. Gall's thing? She inquired, as we trundled along in our cab. There's probably nothing to it, but it's so out of the ordinary, it somehow seems worth looking into. I'm going there straight from Paris, said I, though I don't expect much from it. The explanation will probably be very simple, after all. But what are your plans now that you've gotten as far as Paris? It seemed she was seeing the usual sights, and then going down to the chateau country by way of Chartres. We arranged for a rendezvous at Rumpelmeyer's, which is practically American soil, and managed to fit her visit to Sainte-Chapelle into a free afternoon of mine. As we were looking out the lovely windows, I remarked to Letitia, on the basis of some earlier researches in the guidebook, you know, this chapel was built to house some relics that Louis IX, St. Louis, bought of the Greek emperor of Byzantium. There was a crown of thorns, the sacred lance, and part of the true cross, as they supposed. But a later emperor gave Louis a superb manuscript of the Greek Testament with 10 miniatures in it, in 1269, the year before Louis sailed on his last crusade. And it was from just such miniatures that the stained glass makers of that time got their ideas for the medallions in these magnificent windows, she added joyfully. What a splendid way to imitate them, to put those tiny pictures into huge stained windows, a sort of publication of them in a magnified edition, with the sun itself behind them to intensify their colors. They say the same window looks very different in the morning and in the afternoon. The sun gives such different values to its colors. That will be something to try out at Chartres when they say the windows are much finer even than these, I responded. But the light was already failing, and we reluctantly left for the mild gaiety of Rumpelmeyer's, where the presence of numerous chatty compatriots served to mitigate what Tish described as the homesick time of day. I also contrived to make the journey to Chartres with Tish, and we had a great day of it, though we only got by the afternoon light on the cathedral windows. But an American painter who was at work there showed us his pictures of La Belle Verrerie by the morning and also by afternoon light, and it was amazing to see what different values the bands of color took on at different times of day. Tish reverted to her favorite doctrine that the designs in the windows were really magnified miniatures drawn from the old Greek manuscripts. It's just as though they had put tiny miniatures, no bigger than 6 or 8 postage stamps, into a stereopticon and thrown them on a huge screen, so that inches of color became yards of it, she exclaimed, as we stood entranced before the grandest of windows, La Belle Verrerie, and scrutinized its medallions, trying to think how they must have looked as tiny miniatures in some monkish manuscript. Wouldn't it be exciting to find the very manuscript these were copied from? I idly mused. But I suppose they would all be faded out by this time. Think of it, 700 years or nearly that. That's the beauty of manuscript miniatures, cried Tish. They don't fade. How can they, all shut up in a book and protected from the light? That's why their colors are so exquisite still, after all these centuries. Of course, they're often flaked a lot, and sometimes people have handled them until the paint is all worn off and the only drawing is the red outline remains. But whatever color there is just what the old monks who painted them put there 1,000 years ago, more or less. What a library those Byzantine emperors must have had to be able to make presents like that manuscript one of them sent to St. Louis, I reflected. Whatever became of it, does anyone know? Well, some few things from it have recently been found at the Saray at Istanbul, said Tish, but it must have contained lots more than that. The Turks are generally supposed to have destroyed it, aren't they? What an awful thing to have done. It's certainly one of the unsolved problems of history, what really became of it, said I. But I could never make myself think that the Byzantines were such tremendous lovers of such things would ever permit it to perish. How could they help it, said Tish. The city was taken by assault, and the emperor himself died fighting in the breach. There was no time to spirit things away or smuggle them out to safety. The treasures of Byzantium must have perished with the Byzantines who owned them. But lots of them got away, I urged, and some of the churches continued in use for many years. Some of them certainly got manuscripts out. For after 1453, they kept drifting into Italy and the West for years. Then perhaps that's what became of the library, Tish argued hopefully. Perhaps it was just scattered in that way and was taken up into Italian collections. In that case, it wasn't so wonderful as we've been supposing, said I, for the manuscripts that drifted into Italy after the fall of Constantinople aren't such a rich and beautiful lot as you'd expect from the Imperial Library of Constantinople. Why, when a man like Michael Paleologus sent Louis that fine New Testament, he must have had much finer ones of his own. What became of them? That's what I want to know. But Tish couldn't tell me, and we raised our eyes again to the magnificent west windows, already growing fainter in the late afternoon light. We lingered until their brilliance grew dim with twilight, and then reluctantly left the cathedral, Tish lamenting the fate of the Constantinople Library, and I even more regretful over the passing of such a heavenly day in her gay, embracing society. For there we had to part again. She was to proceed next morning to the Chateau country, and I caught some kind of train that night back to Paris.